Millionaire cruelly abandoned his beloved. 8 months later, he is paralyzed when he sees her pregnant, working as a waitress in a luxury restaurant. He approached. The warm glow of the city lights reflected off the glass walls of the Bennett Corporation's headquarters, where Alexander Bennett leaned against the balcony of his luxurious penthouse. His eyes scanned the skyline, but his mind was elsewhere, lost in the memory of her Grace, the woman who had turned his perfectly structured world upside down. She was different from anyone he had ever met. While the women in his circle were polished, calculating, and driven by status, Grace was pure. She didn't care about money, power, or the weight of his last name. With her, he felt like Alexander, not just a Bennett tonight, as he waited for her in the secluded restaurant where they often met in secret. He felt a mix of excitement and unease. Grace was late, which was unlike her. He drummed his fingers against the table, glancing at the entrance every few seconds. Then, finally, she appeared. "Sorry I'm late," she said, a little out of breath, her cheeks flushed. Alexander smirked, pulling out a chair for her. "I was starting to think you stood me up." She rolled her eyes playfully. "As if I could ever do that." Her sincerity made something tighten in his chest. He reached for her hand across the table. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice lower, more serious. "Maybe we don't have to hide anymore." Grace's eyes widened. "You mean, telling your family?" "Yes," he exhaled. "I know my mother won't approve, but I don't care. Before he could finish, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen. Eleanor Bennett. His stomach twisted. His mother never called without a reason. Sighing, he silenced it and turned his attention back to Grace. But that call was just the beginning of what would soon shatter everything. The trap begins back at the Bennett estate. Eleanor paced the grand living room, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had spent decades crafting the perfect image of their family, ensuring Alexander's future was secure within their empire. There was no room for distractions, and certainly no room for a nobody like Grace, she had warned Alexander once. But now, it was time to eliminate the problem. A quick call to her private investigator, followed by a hefty bribe, was all it took. By morning, Eleanor had evidence in her hands. Photos. Messages. Manufactured but convincing. Enough to destroy any trust Alexander had in Grace. When Alexander entered the house that evening, Eleanor greeted him with an affectionate but calculating smile. "My darling," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "There's something you need to see." He frowned. "What is it?" Eleanor handed him a folder. I wanted to believe she was different, but she sighed, feigning regret. "See for yourself." Reluctantly, he opened the folder. His hands trembled as he saw the photos. Grace, sitting in a cafe with a man he didn't recognize. A text message thread where she allegedly demanded money to stay in the relationship. His heart pounded. This couldn't be real. "No," he muttered. "Grace would never." "Sweetheart." Eleanor placed a gentle hand on his. "I know you have feelings for her, but you have to be smart." She saw an opportunity, and she took it. She played you. Alexander clenched his jaw. He wanted, needed, to believe in Grace. But doubt crept in like a slow poison. The evidence was overwhelming. And hadn't he always known that people like Grace could never truly belong in his world? "I won't let her humiliate you," Eleanor added. "It's time you end this, before she takes even more from you." A war raged inside him. But in the end, his pride won. By the time the sun set, Alexander had made his decision. Grace wouldn't get the chance to betray him again. Betrayal in the night. The knock on Grace's apartment door was sharp and impatient. She opened it, her face lighting up when she saw Alexander. "Hey," she smiled. "You didn't answer my messages." But the look in his eyes made her stop cold. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't love. It was anger. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside. Grace's heart pounded. "What's wrong?" He threw the folder onto the small kitchen table. "Explain this." Confused, she picked up the photos and the printed messages. Her breath caught in her throat. What is this?" "Don't play dumb, Grace." His voice was sharp, almost unrecognizable. "You were with him. You asked me for money." Tears welled in her eyes. "Alexander, I swear to you, I don't know where this came from. This is a lie." He let out a bitter laugh. "A lie. Everything about you was a lie." Grace felt like the ground was collapsing beneath her. The man she loved, the man she thought knew her heart, was looking at her as if she were nothing. "I never want to see you again," he said coldly. "Stay the hell away from me." And with that, he walked out the door. Grace called after him, sobbing, but he never looked back. That night, she sat on the floor of her tiny apartment, staring at the photos through tear-blurred eyes. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for this exact moment, she felt it. A sharp pain in her stomach, a sudden, terrifying realization. She wasn't just losing Alexander. She was pregnant. The city buzzed with life. But for Grace, everything felt eerily silent. The weight of Alexander's betrayal sat heavy on her chest, suffocating. She had spent the entire night curled up in the corner of her tiny apartment, clutching her stomach, as if somehow she could protect the fragile life growing inside her. Pregnant? The realization hit her over and over again. But the pain of Alexander's rejection drowned out any joy she might have felt. He hadn't even given her a chance to defend herself. He had looked her in the eyes, those same eyes that once held love and devotion, and had thrown her away like she was nothing. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone. She needed to call him. He needed to know. But then, she stopped. Would it even matter? He had already made up his mind about her. The Alexander she loved, the one who held her close at night, whispered dreams of a future together, was gone. A loud knock on the door jolted her from her thoughts. She wiped her tears quickly, dragging herself to her feet before opening it. Mrs. Carter, the landlord, stood there with her usual disapproving glare. "I've given you enough chances, Grace," she said, arms crossed. "The rent's overdue again. Either you pay today or you're out." Grace swallowed hard. I just need a little more time. I'll get the money, I swear." Mrs. Carter scoffed. "I'm done with promises. You have until the end of the day." And just like that, she turned and left, leaving Grace standing in the doorway, feeling like the world was caving in around her. She had no job, no money, nowhere to go. Her fingers instinctively touched her stomach, a silent promise forming in her heart. She might have lost everything, but she wouldn't lose this baby. She wouldn't let this child suffer because of Alexander's cruel mistake. She needed a plan. The first thing she did was call Lillian, her closest friend, the only person she could trust. Within an hour, they were sitting in a small cafe, Grace stirring a cup of tea absently while Lillian stared at her in shock. "You're pregnant," Lillian whispered, barely able to contain her disbelief. Grace nodded, staring at the table. "And I have nowhere to go." "I don't know what to do, Lily." Lillian's expression softened. "Does Alexander know?" "No." Grace let out a bitter laugh. "And I'm not telling him. He didn't believe me when it mattered. Why should I believe he'd care about this?" Lillian sighed. "He's an idiot, Grace. But you can't go through this alone. I don't have a choice." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, Lillian took a deep breath. "I have a friend. She knows someone who runs a shelter for women. Maybe they can help." The idea of living in a shelter made Grace's stomach twist. But what other option did she have? She had to survive. For her baby. She nodded. "Okay, let's go." The shelter was small but warm, filled with women in various stages of rebuilding their lives. A kind woman named Ruth welcomed Grace with a gentle smile and an understanding gaze. "You're safe here," Ruth assured her. "We'll help you find work. You'll get through this." And for the first time in days, Grace allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she would. Meanwhile, across town, Alexander sat in his office, drowning himself in work. But no amount of business deals or stock reports could erase the hollow feeling in his chest. Grace had betrayed him, hadn't she? Then why couldn't he shake the feeling that something wasn't right? His mother had assured him that she had only been looking out for him, that she had simply uncovered the truth before it was too late. But it all happened so quickly, so conveniently. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. A small voice in the back of his mind whispered a terrifying thought. What if he had made a mistake? But before he could dwell on it further, his office door opened, and Eleanor walked in, her usual composed elegance intact. "Darling," she said, her voice sweet but firm, "I just wanted to check on you. I know this has been difficult." Alexander studied her. His mother. the woman who had shaped his entire life, who had always been ruthless in protecting their family's legacy. "She's out of my life," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You don't have to worry about her anymore." Eleanor smiled, a satisfied glint in her eyes. "I knew you'd come to your senses." But as she kissed his forehead and walked away, that voice inside him refused to be silenced. What if Grace had never betrayed him? And what if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life? Days passed, but the ache in Grace's chest remained as raw as the night Alexander walked away. She had lost count of how many times she had replayed that moment in her head, searching for something, anything, that could explain why he had so easily believed the worst about her. But no matter how much she tortured herself with the memories, the truth was clear. He hadn't even hesitated. He had thrown her away without a second thought. Now, she sat on a worn-out mattress in the shelter's shared bedroom, staring at the tiny notebook in her lap. Names, ideas, anything to make this baby feel real, to remind herself that this child was hers, and no one could take that away from her. But reality was cruel. She had no money, no job, and no home of her own. The shelter was temporary, and the weight of that truth pressed down on her every second of the day. That morning, Ruth found her in the kitchen, staring absently at a cup of tea. "You barely touched your breakfast," Ruth said, sitting beside her. "You need to eat, sweetheart, for the baby." Grace offered a weak smile. "I know, I feel lost." Ruth reached for her hand. "You're not alone. We'll figure something out." The kindness in her voice was enough to make Grace's throat tighten. But before she could respond, another resident walked into the kitchen, a worried expression on her face. "There's someone at the front asking for Grace," she said hesitantly. "A woman." Grace frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone. With a deep breath, she pushed back from the table and made her way to the entrance. The moment she stepped into the hallway, her blood ran cold. Eleanor Bennett stood there, poised and elegant, as if she had just stepped out of a high society gala. Everything about her screamed control, from the sharp lines of her tailored dress to the way she held her purse as if she was above touching anything unworthy. Grace's fingers instinctively curled over her stomach. Eleanor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You look well, dear, considering." Grace forced herself to stand tall. "What do you want?" The older woman sighed, tilting her head slightly. "I came to offer you some advice." Grace said nothing, waiting. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice lowering. "I hope you're not foolish enough to believe Alexander will ever come back to you." Something in Grace's chest twisted, but she refused to let it show. "I don't expect anything from him." "Good." Eleanor's eyes flickered briefly to Grace's stomach, her smile tightening. "Because my son has moved on. He's already making arrangements for his future, a future that doesn't include you." Grace swallowed hard, but she didn't look away. Eleanor took another step forward. "You should disappear, Grace. Find a new life somewhere far from here. You don't belong in Alexander's world." "You never did." A sharp, bitter laugh bubbled up in Grace's throat. "You really think I care about your world?" Eleanor's expression darkened. "Then why are you still here?" Grace held her ground. "Because unlike you, I don't run away when things get hard, and I won't let you scare me." Eleanor studied her for a long moment before sighing dramatically. "You're a stubborn girl. It's almost admirable." Then, her voice dropped to something icier. "But let me be clear. If you ever try to involve Alexander in this mistake of yours, I'll make sure you regret it." Grace's fingers dug into her palms, but she refused to let Eleanor see her break. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, stepping forward until there was barely any space between them. "This child is not a mistake." Her voice was steady, unwavering. "And whether you like it or not, I will survive without your son or his money. You don't control me." For the first time, Eleanor's expression faltered slightly. But then, just as quickly, she smoothed it back into place. "We'll see," she murmured, before turning and walking out the door. Grace watched her go, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew Eleanor wasn't the type to make empty threats, but she had survived this long. She would keep surviving. Back at the Bennett estate, Alexander sat in his office staring at his phone. He had picked it up at least a dozen times, hovering over Grace's name in his contacts. But every time, he stopped himself. She had fooled him. He had seen the proof. So why did something still feel wrong? The door creaked open, and Eleanor stepped inside, her usual confidence in place. "I just saw her," she announced, settling into a chair across from him. Alexander tensed. "You did what?" "I went to make sure she understood that you've moved on." His stomach twisted. "Why would you do that?" Eleanor sighed as if he were being difficult. "Because I know you, darling. You're too soft-hearted when it comes to women like her. I simply ensured she wouldn't try to manipulate you again." Something inside him snapped. "Stay out of this," he said, his voice lower, angrier than he'd intended. "I don't need you handling my business." Eleanor arched an eyebrow. "Are you defending her?" "I'm saying I don't need you interfering," he bit out. "I can handle my own mistakes." She studied him for a moment before offering a small, knowing smile. "Of course, dear." Then she stood. "I'm only doing what's best for you." As she left, Alexander exhaled heavily, running a hand down his face. Grace was out of his life. He had made his choice. So why did it feel like he had lost something he could never get back? Grace sat on the edge of her bed that night, cradling her stomach gently. She had nothing. No money, no security, no home of her own. But she had her baby. And she would never let anyone take that away from her. The days blurred into one another, each one harder than the last. Grace tried to hold on to her resolve, to remind herself that she had survived this far and that she would continue to survive. But survival was a cruel thing. It didn't come easy, and it didn't wait for anyone to be ready. Her shifts at the restaurant were long and exhausting, her feet aching by the time she finally stumbled back to the shelter. The weight of her growing belly made every movement slower, every task harder, and yet, she couldn't stop. She had to keep pushing forward because there was no other option. Ruth watched her closely. Concern etched into every glance she stole. One evening, after closing up the shelter's small kitchen, she sat across from Grace and studied her for a long moment. "You're working yourself into the ground," Ruth finally said, her voice gentle but firm. Grace forced a smile, stirring the lukewarm tea in front of her. "I have to. You have to take care of yourself too," Ruth countered. "You can't pour from an empty cup, sweetheart." Grace exhaled, rubbing her hands over her belly. "I don't have a choice." "Yes, you do." Ruth reached across the table and took Grace's hand in hers. "Let people help you." Grace wanted to argue, to tell Ruth that she didn't want to depend on anyone ever again. But before she could, the shelter's front door creaked open, and Lillian rushed in, breathless and wide-eyed. "I just saw him," Lillian blurted out, hands gripping the edge of the table as she caught her breath. Grace's stomach dropped. "Who?" "Alexander." Her fingers tightened around her tea mug, the warmth suddenly burning against her skin. "What do you mean you saw him?" Lillian hesitated, glancing at Ruth before lowering her voice. "He was downtown, at the restaurant near my office. He looked different." Grace didn't want to ask, didn't want to care, but she couldn't stop herself. Different how? Lillian hesitated, like he wasn't sleeping, like something was eating away at him. Grace swallowed hard and looked away. She shouldn't care. He had made his choice. He had thrown her away. Whatever guilt he was feeling now wasn't her concern. "He's not our problem," she muttered. But later that night, as she lay awake on the lumpy mattress, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, she couldn't stop her mind from drifting to him, to the nights they spent tangled in each other's arms, whispering dreams of a future that would never come to pass. She placed a hand on her belly, closing her eyes. No, Alexander wasn't her problem anymore. Across town, Alexander sat in his darkened penthouse, a glass of whiskey untouched on the table beside him. He had tried everything to push Grace from his thoughts. Work, distractions, nights spent pretending he was the same man he had always been. But he wasn't, because now he knew what it felt like to lose something real. He had everything: power, money, influence, but none of it mattered. None of it could erase the nagging doubt clawing at his chest. What if he had been wrong? What if Eleanor had manipulated him into pushing away the only woman who had ever truly loved him? The thought made his stomach churn. He had spent his whole life trusting his mother, believing that she always had his best interests at heart. But the way she had spoken about Grace, the satisfaction in her voice when she said she had handled things, it didn't sit right with him. He grabbed his phone before he could think better of it. Scrolling to Grace's name, his thumb hovered over the call button. But what would he even say? He had destroyed her. With a bitter sigh, he tossed the phone onto the table and leaned back in his chair. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it, even if it killed him. Grace woke the next morning feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her like a physical force. Every step felt heavier, every breath a little harder, but she pushed through it, forcing herself into the too-tight uniform of the restaurant and heading to work. The shift was brutal. Customers were impatient. Her feet ached, and the manager snapped at her for moving too slowly. By the time the dinner rush began, she was barely holding herself together. Then, as she turned a corner too fast, balancing a heavy tray of dishes, she felt it, a sharp pain in her lower abdomen. She gasped, stumbling as the tray slipped from her hands and crashed onto the floor. The entire restaurant went silent as plates shattered around her feet. The manager was on her in seconds. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Grace clutched her stomach, trying to steady herself. I'm sorry, I don't need excuses," he snapped. "You're a liability, Grace. I can't have you dropping dishes in the middle of a dinner rush." Tears burned in her eyes. "Please, I need this job." "You're done," he cut her off, turning away. "Pack your things and get out." Grace stood frozen, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. She was jobless. Again, slowly, she turned and walked out of the restaurant, the cold night air hitting her like a slap to the face. She wrapped her arms around herself, her breath coming in uneven gasps. How much more could she take? She didn't know how long she stood there, but eventually, she forced herself to move. She had to get back to the shelter. She had to figure out what came next as she walked down the dark streets, the city lights blurring through her unshed tears. She made a silent promise to the life growing inside her. She would not break. She would not give up. No matter how hard things got, she would fight, because if no one else in the world would fight for her, she would fight for herself and for this baby. The cold wind bit at Grace's skin as she walked back to the shelter, her arms wrapped around her stomach in a futile attempt to shield herself from the night air. The weight of everything that had happened in the past few hours pressed down on her, making every step feel heavier. She had lost her job, her only source of income, and once again, she was back to square one. She knew she had to tell Ruth. The older woman had been nothing but kind to her, offering her a place to stay and encouraging her to keep going, even when she felt like she couldn't. But admitting out loud that she had failed, again, felt like too much to bear. When she finally arrived at the shelter, the lights were dim, most of the residents already asleep. She moved quietly through the halls, but just as she reached her room, Ruth appeared at the doorway, her gaze immediately landing on Grace's tear-streaked face. "What happened?" Ruth asked gently. Grace bit the inside of her cheek, shaking her head as she stepped inside and sank onto the small bed. "I lost my job." Her voice was barely above a whisper. I dropped a tray of dishes, and they fired me on the spot." Ruth sat beside her, reaching for her hand. "Oh, sweetheart, I don't know what to do," Grace admitted, her voice breaking. "I feel like I keep trying, and no matter what I do, everything just keeps falling apart." Ruth squeezed her hand. "You're stronger than you think, Grace. I know it feels impossible right now, but you'll get through this." Grace wiped at her eyes, nodding, even though she wasn't sure she believed it. "Get some rest," Ruth said softly. "Tomorrow, we'll figure something out." Grace wanted to believe her. She wanted to believe that things would get better. But as she lay awake in the dark, staring at the cracked ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that her world was slowly crumbling beneath her feet. The next evening, Grace forced herself to push forward. She had spent the day searching for new job openings, but nothing promising had come up. Most places weren't willing to hire a pregnant woman, especially one so close to giving birth. But she couldn't afford to stop trying. So she took a deep breath, straightened her posture, and stepped into the restaurant for her usual routine. Not as an employee, but as a reminder of what she had lost. The place was packed, the low hum of conversation filling the air as waiters moved swiftly between tables, balancing trays of drinks and entrees. The smell of roasted garlic and seared steak filled her nostrils, making her stomach twist with hunger. She shouldn't have come. She should have stayed at the shelter, hidden away from the cruel reminders of the life she had lost. But just as she turned to leave, she heard a voice, one she hadn't heard in months. one she never thought she would hear again. "Grace!" Her entire body froze. The blood in her veins turned to ice. Slowly, she turned around, her eyes locking onto the one person she had been trying so hard to forget. Alexander. He was sitting at a table near the back of the restaurant, a glass of whiskey in front of him, his suit impeccable as always. But there was something different about him. His sharp features looked more hollow, his eyes darker, as if he hadn't been sleeping, and then his gaze fell to her stomach. Everything else in the room disappeared. The noise, the people, the movement. It all faded into nothing as Alexander stared at the undeniable truth in front of him. She was pregnant. His child Grace felt her breath catch, panic rising in her chest. She had wanted to tell him once, had convinced herself that he deserved to know, but that had been months ago, before he had abandoned her, before he had believed the worst about her. Now, it was too late. Alexander stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as he took a step toward her. "Grace," he said again, this time softer, almost disbelieving. She forced herself to move, to shake off the weight of the moment. Without a word, she turned and headed for the exit, but he was faster. His hand closed around her wrist, stopping her in her tracks. "Let me go," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "Grace, please," he said, his grip loosening, his tone raw with something she couldn't quite place. Is it mine?" She wrenched her hand free and took a step back, lifting her chin. "It doesn't matter." His expression twisted, pain flashing in his eyes. "Of course it matters. You're pregnant and You what?" She cut him off, her voice sharp. "You suddenly care? After throwing me away like I was nothing?" Alexander flinched, guilt tightening his jaw. "I made a mistake." Grace let out a bitter laugh. "A mistake." She gestured at her belly. "This is what you left behind, Alexander, and now you think you can just show up and act like you care." He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "I didn't know, Grace. You didn't want to know," she snapped. "You made your choice, and so did I." He took a step closer, his voice almost desperate. "Grace, please, just let me talk to you." Tears burned at the edges of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "No, Alexander, you don't get to do this. Not now. Not after everything." For a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue, like he wanted to fight for something, but then, just as quickly, his shoulders sagged and he nodded, swallowing hard. "I won't force you," he said quietly, "but I'm not walking away this time." Grace didn't respond. She couldn't. Instead, she turned and walked out of the restaurant, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. She didn't stop until she was outside, the cold air shocking her lungs. She had survived without him this long. She would keep surviving, no matter how much seeing him again had made her heart ache. The night air was sharp against Grace's skin as she walked away from the restaurant, her heart still hammering against her ribs. She kept her head down, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped her coat tighter around herself. She needed to get away, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the man who had just shattered what little peace she had left. Alexander had seen her, he knew, and judging by the look in his eyes, this wasn't over. She should have been prepared for this moment, should have known that eventually their paths would cross again, but she hadn't expected the sheer force of emotions that had hit her the moment his gaze had fallen on her stomach. He looked broken, but it didn't change anything. He had chosen to believe lies. He had abandoned her when she needed him most, and she had spent too many nights crying over a man who had proven she was never enough for him. She reached the shelter faster than she expected, her breathing uneven as she pushed through the door. Ruth was waiting in the small common area, knitting in her usual chair, her sharp eyes immediately locking onto Grace's face. "Sweetheart, what happened?" Ruth asked, setting down her yarn. Grace hesitated, still feeling the ghost of Alexander's touch on her wrist, the desperation in his voice as he had asked if the baby was his. She swallowed hard. "I saw him," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Alexander." Ruth didn't react immediately. She simply studied Grace for a long moment before exhaling softly. "And how do you feel about that?" Grace let out a hollow laugh, like the world is playing some kind of cruel joke on me. She sank onto the worn couch, rubbing her forehead. "He knows now. I didn't tell him. But he saw me, and the way he looked at me." Ruth leaned forward, resting her hands on her knees. "And what do you want to do about it?" The question made Grace's stomach twist. "Nothing," she said quickly. "He made his choice. He left. But now he knows the truth," Ruth pointed out gently. Grace squeezed her eyes shut. "That doesn't change what he did. It doesn't change how he looked at me that night. Like I was worthless. Like I had betrayed him." She swallowed hard. "I can't go through that again." Ruth sighed, but didn't push her further. Instead, she patted Grace's knee gently. "You know I'll support whatever decision you make. Just make sure it's one that lets you sleep at night." Grace nodded, but she knew sleep wouldn't come easy tonight. Across the city, Alexander sat in the back of his car, staring blankly out the window as his driver took him home. His mind was spinning, every part of him still stuck in that moment at the restaurant, still seeing Grace standing there, carrying his child. His child. It was as if everything had come to a screeching halt the second he realized the truth. And now, all he could think about was the past, the nights they had spent wrapped in each other, the way she used to look at him with absolute trust, and the way he had thrown it all away. The guilt was suffocating. He had believed his mother's lies, had let himself be manipulated into thinking the worst of the one woman who had ever truly loved him. He had been a coward, letting his pride dictate his actions instead of listening to his heart. And now she wanted nothing to do with him. The car rolled to a stop in front of the Bennett estate, but Alexander barely noticed. He climbed out, walking through the grand doors without acknowledging the staff, his mind elsewhere. Eleanor was waiting for him in the living room, sipping a glass of wine, as if she hadn't just single-handedly destroyed his life. "You're late," she remarked, her voice cool. Alexander ignored her, walking straight to the liquor cabinet and pouring himself a drink. "You saw her, didn't you?" Eleanor continued, her tone laced with something that sounded like amusement. Alexander took a slow sip, his jaw tightening. "You knew," Eleanor sighed, setting her glass down with an exasperated shake of her head. "I had my suspicions." His fingers tightened around his glass. "And you didn't think to tell me." Eleanor shrugged. "Would it have changed anything?" Alexander slammed his glass onto the table, the sharp sound echoing through the room. "She's carrying my child. Mother, you knew. And you still let me believe she was some kind of gold digger that she—" He broke off, shaking his head as anger swelled inside him. Eleanor's expression remained impassive. "And what exactly do you plan to do about it?" The question hit him harder than it should have. He didn't have an answer, because the truth was, he didn't know. He had ruined everything, and now he had no idea if he could ever fix it. Back at the shelter, Grace lay awake in bed, her hands resting protectively over her belly. The baby kicked softly, a reminder that no matter how lost she felt, she wasn't alone. She had promised herself she wouldn't break. She had survived this far without Alexander, and she would keep surviving without him, even if, deep down, a small part of her still ached for the man he used to be. Grace spent the rest of her shift in a daze, moving through the motions like a ghost of herself. She barely registered the orders she took, the coffee she poured, or the conversations buzzing around her. The only thing echoing in her mind was Alexander's voice. "I love you." She wanted to erase those words from her memory, to pretend they had never been spoken. But no matter how hard she tried, they clung to her, pulling at the parts of her that she had worked so hard to seal away. When the shift finally ended, she changed in the tiny employee bathroom, her body aching from exhaustion. As she stepped outside into the crisp evening air, she half expected to see him waiting for her, but he wasn't there. A strange mix of relief and disappointment settled in her chest. She told herself it was for the best. She had spent months building a life without him, proving to herself that she didn't need Alexander Bennett or his money, that she was strong enough to raise this child on her own. But then why did it feel like a part of her was still waiting? She pulled her coat tighter around herself and started the familiar walk back to the shelter, her thoughts tangled in the chaos of emotion she didn't want to feel by the time she arrived. The common area was quiet, most of the women already in their rooms for the night. Ruth sat at the small kitchen table, sipping tea, her sharp gaze landing on Grace the second she walked in. "Rough night?" Ruth asked, setting her mug down. Grace hesitated before sighing and dropping into the chair across from her. "I saw him again." Ruth didn't look surprised. "And he wants to be involved." Grace admitted, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. He says he loves me, that he wants to fix things. Ruth studied her carefully before speaking. And what do you want? Grace opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because she didn't know. I want to hate him, she finally whispered. I want to tell him to stay out of my life and never look back. But, Ruth prompted gently, but a part of me still remembers what it felt like to love him. Ruth nodded, as if she had expected that answer. Grace, people make mistakes, some worse than others. The question is, can you ever forgive him? Grace swallowed hard, staring at her hands. I don't know. Then take your time, Ruth said simply. He doesn't get to rush you. If he truly means what he says, he'll prove it. Grace wanted to believe that, but believing in Alexander Bennett had only ever led to heartbreak. Alexander sat in his penthouse, a drink in his hand, staring blankly at the skyline. The city stretched before him, glittering in the night, but he felt nothing. All he could think about was Grace, the way she had looked at him, the hurt in her eyes, the way her body had instinctively tensed when he had stepped closer. She didn't trust him, and why should she? He had destroyed her world and left her to fend for herself, and now he expected her to believe that he had changed. He exhaled sharply, setting his glass down before pulling out his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen before he finally made the call. It rang twice before Eleanor answered. Alexander? She greeted smoothly, as if nothing was wrong. His grip on the phone tightened. How long have you known? Eleanor sighed, as if he were a child throwing a tantrum. Darling, I already told you I had my suspicions, and you didn't think I had a right to know. You had a right to not ruin your life over a mistake, she said sharply. That girl is the mother of my child. Alexander cut her off, his voice cold. Silence stretched between them before Eleanor finally spoke again, her tone softer but just as cutting. Alexander, you need to think about your future, about the company. Do you really want to throw everything away for her? I'd rather lose everything than let you control me again. Eleanor let out a small, bitter laugh. You're being dramatic. No, I'm finally seeing you for who you really are. For the first time in his life, he felt no fear in standing up to her, no hesitation. Eleanor had manipulated him for years, shaping him into the man she wanted him to be, but she had gone too far. He had lost Grace because of her, and he would never forgive her for that. I don't want anything from you, he said. Not your money, not your approval. Stay out of my life. Before she could respond, he ended the call, and for the first time in months he felt free. Grace tossed and turned in bed, unable to quiet the thoughts racing through her mind. Everything was changing too fast. She had spent so long convincing herself that Alexander was part of her past, that she would never have to see him again. And now he was here, fighting for something she wasn't sure she could give him. A part of her wanted to believe him, to believe that he truly regretted what he had done. But how could she trust someone who had shattered her so completely? She placed a hand on her belly, feeling a small, reassuring kick. No matter what happened, this child would have a mother who would fight for them. And if Alexander truly wanted to be in their life, he would have to prove that he was worthy of it. No more empty promises, no more words. She needed actions. And this time, she was the one in control. The next few days passed in a whirlwind, but Grace couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled deep in her chest. She told herself that Alexander wouldn't keep trying, that their encounter at the cafe had been the end of it. But deep down, she knew better. He wasn't the kind of man to walk away from something he wanted, and now, for the first time in his life, he wanted her back. She just wasn't sure what that meant. Still, she pushed forward. She had no time to dwell on her emotions, not when there were more pressing matters. Without a job, her options were shrinking by the day. The shelter was temporary, and while Ruth assured her she could stay as long as she needed, Grace hated the idea of relying on charity. She wanted to stand on her own 2 feet, to prove, to herself more than anyone, that she could build a life without Alexander Bennett. But the world wasn't making it easy. Every application she submitted was met with hesitation. Employers didn't want to hire a woman who would be on maternity leave in a matter of weeks. The best she could hope for was temporary work, but even that was proving impossible. The weight of her situation pressed down on her like an anchor, and no matter how hard she tried to stay afloat, she was sinking. That evening, as she sat in the small lounge of the shelter, staring at the list of rejection emails on her phone, Ruth sat down beside her. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world," Ruth remarked, offering her a warm cup of tea. Grace let out a humorless laugh, taking the cup but not drinking. "Because I am." Ruth studied her for a moment. "He's not going away, you know." Grace stiffened. "I know. You're allowed to let him help," Ruth said gently. Grace set the cup down on the table with a little more force than necessary. "I don't want his help. I don't need it," Ruth sighed, reaching for Grace's hand. "Sweetheart, needing help doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." Grace swallowed hard, but before she could respond, a knock sounded at the shelter's entrance. A second later, Lillian peeked in. "Grace?" Lillian's voice was cautious, like she was bracing for impact. "You need to come outside." A sense of dread curled in Grace's stomach. She didn't even need to ask. She already knew. Alexander, with her heart pounding, she stood and made her way to the door, and there he was, standing just beyond the threshold, hands in his pockets, looking entirely out of place against the worn brick of the shelter. His expensive coat, his polished shoes. He didn't belong here, but for once, he didn't look like Alexander Bennett, the ruthless heir to a fortune. He just looked like a man carrying regret. Grace folded her arms. "What are you doing here?" Alexander exhaled, his breath visible in the cool evening air. "I told you I wouldn't give up." She clenched her jaw. "And I told you to stay out of my life." He nodded, as if he had expected that. "I'm not here to force anything, Grace. I know you need a job. I have connections. I can help you." A bitter laugh escaped her lips before she could stop it. "Of course, just throw money at the problem. That's what you do, right?" His expression didn't waver. "No, that's what my mother does. I want to fix what I broke. Not with money, but with actions." Grace shook her head. "I don't trust you." "I know," he admitted. "And I don't blame you, but let me do something. Let me help." She wanted to say, "No." She wanted to tell him to turn around and never come back, but the exhaustion in her bones, the fear of what would happen when her time at the shelter ran out, those were very real, and as much as she hated it, so was he. She took a deep breath. "I don't want your charity." "It wouldn't be charity," he said carefully. "It would be an opportunity, a real job, no strings attached." Her heart clenched. She wanted to believe him, but how could she? As if sensing her hesitation, he stepped forward slightly. "Grace, if nothing else, do it for the baby." Her entire body went rigid. Low blow, and yet, he wasn't wrong. She let out a slow breath, her head spinning. "Fine," she said, surprising even herself. "But if I get so much as a hint of manipulation, I'm out. Understand?" Something flashed in his eyes. "Hope. I understand." "Good." She stepped back toward the door. "Then set up the interview. I'll handle the rest." And without waiting for another word, she turned and walked inside, closing the door behind her. Her heart was racing, her mind screaming at her that this was a mistake. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure. Alexander stood outside the shelter for a long moment, staring at the closed door. This was just the first step, and he would keep taking them, one by one, until she believed in him again. Grace barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she replayed the conversation with Alexander, analyzing every word, every hesitation in his voice, every flicker of emotion in his eyes. She hated that she was even considering this. She had sworn to herself that she would never need him again, that she would never let him have even the smallest hold over her life. And yet, here she was, by morning, the reality of what she had agreed to hit her like a freight train. She had told him yes, a job, an opportunity, no strings attached, he had said. She wasn't naive enough to believe that. Still, she showed up at Rosie's cafe for her shift as if nothing had changed, trying to convince herself that she wasn't waiting for him to follow through. But just as she wiped down the last table of the breakfast rush, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. For a long moment, she just stared at the screen. Then, with a deep breath, she answered. "Hello, Grace? It's me." Alexander's voice came through the line, careful and measured, as if he was unsure whether she would hang up. I have a meeting set up for you this afternoon, 3 o'clock. It's a position as an office assistant at a small marketing firm. Nothing glamorous, but it's a start. Grace swallowed. He had actually done it. No strings? She asked, gripping the edge of the counter. No strings, he promised. She should have been relieved. Instead, a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation twisted inside her. Where's the office? I'll text you the address, he said, then hesitated. Grace, thank you for letting me do this. She exhaled sharply. I haven't taken the job yet, Alexander. I know, he admitted, but I'm trying. For a moment, she didn't respond. Then quietly, she said, I'll let you know how it goes. And with that, she hung up. The interview was at a sleek but modest office downtown. The woman who interviewed her, Margaret, was professional but kind, asking standard questions about her experience. Grace answered as best as she could, ignoring the nerves bubbling inside her. She was qualified for this. She was more than capable. When the interview ended, Margaret offered a polite smile. We'll be making a decision soon, but I can already tell you have a strong work ethic. We'll be in touch. Grace thanked her, shook her hand, and walked out of the office with her head held high. She had done this. She, not Alexander. She was halfway down the block when she saw him, leaning against a sleek black car, hands in his pockets, watching her. Her steps slowed. What are you doing here? Alexander pushed off the car, his gaze searching hers. I wanted to know how it went. She studied him, trying to find an ulterior motive, some hidden agenda, but there was nothing in his face except quiet concern. I think it went well, she admitted reluctantly. They said they'd let me know. Alexander nodded. Good. She shifted on her feet. You didn't have to wait for me. I know, he said simply. The silence stretched between them, thick with everything unspoken. Finally, Alexander took a breath. Can I take you somewhere? Grace blinked. What? Not a date, he said quickly, sensing her resistance. Just a drive. No expectations. No pressure. She should have said no. Every rational part of her was screaming at her to turn around and walk away. But for some reason, she found herself nodding. Fine, she muttered. But just a short drive. Alexander opened the car door for her, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself step inside. The drive was quiet at first, the hum of the city outside filling the space between them. She expected him to take her somewhere expensive, somewhere polished and pristine. But instead, he drove to the outskirts of the city, toward a small park overlooking the water. He pulled into an empty spot and cut the engine, staring out at the waves crashing against the shore. This was my favorite place when I was a kid, he said after a long moment, before my mother made sure my life was nothing but business meetings and expectations. Grace turned to look at him. There was something different in his expression, something raw, something real. I know I can't change what I did, he continued, his voice quiet. I know that words don't mean anything after everything I put you through, but I need you to understand. I was wrong, Grace, about everything. She swallowed, her chest tightening. I let my mother manipulate me. I let my pride make decisions for me. And because of that, I lost you. He exhaled. I don't want to lose this baby too. Grace's fingers curled against her lap. I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Alexander. I know, he said, but I'm going to keep showing up. I'm going to keep proving to you that I'm not the man who walked away that night. She stared at him, searching his face, trying to find the arrogance, the entitlement, the coldness that had once defined him. But it wasn't there. For the first time, she saw a man who was truly trying. She looked away, her heart pounding. I need time. You can have all the time you need, he said without hesitation. I'm not going anywhere. The words settled in her chest, unfamiliar and terrifying. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't sure if that was such a bad thing anymore. The wait had been agonizing. Every second felt stretched thin, like the tension in her chest whenever she thought about the direction her life was taking. Grace tried to distract herself, helping Ruth with chores around the shelter, going through old clothes that no longer fit over her growing belly, pretending she wasn't waiting for a call that could change everything. And then, just as she was folding a worn-out sweater, her phone rang. Her heart leapt into her throat. For a second, she hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen. What if it was another rejection? Shoving down her nerves, she swiped to answer. "Hello, Grace. This is Margaret from the marketing firm. We wanted to follow up on your interview." She braced herself. "We'd love to have you on board if you're still interested. The job is yours." The words barely registered at first. She blinked, clutching the fabric in her hands, afraid she had misheard. "Yes," she said breathlessly. "Yes, I'd love to." Margaret chuckled on the other end. "Great, we'll see you Monday at 8. The call ended. But Grace just stood there, frozen in place. She had done it. She had gotten the job, no charity, no handouts, no favors from Alexander. It was hers, earned through her own resilience. Tears burned at the edges of her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away before Ruth could notice. Taking a steady breath, she tried to shake off the whirlwind of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. But even as relief settled in, another thought crept in, unwelcome and persistent. She had to tell Alexander. She hated the idea of him thinking he had anything to do with this. But a part of her, the part that remembered how his face softened when he spoke about wanting to be better, felt like he deserved to know. After all, he had kept his word. That night, she found herself standing outside a small cafe Lillian had mentioned Alexander liked. The idea of showing up at his penthouse was too much, too personal, but this felt neutral, safe. Pushing through the doors, she scanned the room, her pulse quickening when she found him. He sat alone at a corner table, sleeves rolled up, a black coffee untouched in front of him. His hair was slightly tousled, his face unreadable as he stared down at his phone. For a brief moment, she hesitated. What was she doing here? But before she could turn back, he lifted his gaze, and the second their eyes met, something flickered across his face. Surprise, then something softer, something unguarded. Slowly, he stood. Grace. She took a breath and stepped forward. "Can we talk?" A flicker of something unreadable passed through his expression, but he nodded, gesturing toward the chair across from him. They sat in silence at first, tension thick between them. She could feel the weight of his stare, waiting for her to speak. Finally, she exhaled. "I got the job." A slow smile broke across his face, and for a moment, she saw the Alexander she had once known, the man who had made her laugh, who had held her hand under the table at fancy restaurants because he hated the stiffness of formality. "That's amazing," he said sincerely. "I knew you would." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "That makes one of us." His expression softened. "You never gave yourself enough credit, Grace." She looked away, tracing the rim of her coffee cup with her finger. She wasn't used to hearing that from him. Not anymore. Then, before she could stop herself, she asked, "Why are you really doing this?" Alexander didn't flinch. "Because I was wrong, and because I want to be better." She studied him carefully, searching for cracks in his sincerity. "And if I don't let you back in," his throat worked as he swallowed, "then I'll still be here, for the baby, if nothing else." Her chest tightened. There was no arrogance in his voice, no expectation, just quiet determination. She exhaled slowly. "I need to take this slow, Alexander." His lips pressed together, but he nodded. "I understand." For the first time, she believed him. They sat in silence for a long time after that. She sipped her coffee, letting the warmth settle in her stomach. He didn't push, didn't try to convince her of anything. He just sat there, waiting. Finally, she pushed back her chair. "I should go." He stood as well. "Can I drive you back?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "I'll walk." His eyes flickered with something. Disappointment. But he didn't argue. "Okay." She turned to leave, but as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Grace?" She looked back. "I meant what I said. I'm not going anywhere." A lump formed in her throat, but she forced herself to nod before stepping out into the cool night air. By the time she reached the shelter, her mind was still tangled with everything that had happened. She had spent so long convincing herself that Alexander was part of her past, that she would never have to see him again. And now he was here, fighting for something she wasn't sure she could give him. A part of her wanted to believe him, to believe that he truly regretted what he had done. But how could she trust someone who had shattered her so completely? She placed a hand on her belly, feeling a small, reassuring kick. No matter what happened, this child would have a mother who would fight for them. And if Alexander truly wanted to be in their life, he would have to prove that he was worthy of it. No more empty promises, no more words. She needed actions, and this time, she was the one in control. Grace woke up before sunrise, her mind restless even after a night of tossing and turning. No matter how much she tried to push Alexander out of her thoughts, he lingered like a ghost, haunting every quiet moment. His words echoed in her mind, weaving their way into her doubts, her anger, and the small, fragile hope she was too afraid to acknowledge. She sat up slowly, rubbing a hand over her stomach. The baby kicked gently, a reminder of the life growing inside her, of the choices she had to make not just for herself, but for both of them. Alexander was trying. She had to admit that much. He had kept his word, helped her find a job without expecting anything in return. And for once, he hadn't pushed her beyond what she was willing to give, but that didn't erase the past. It didn't undo the pain of the night he had abandoned her. She got dressed in silence, pulling on a sweater that barely stretched over her belly, and stepped out of the room just as the shelter's kitchen began to fill with the morning sounds of clinking cups and quiet conversations. Ruth was already there, pouring coffee for the early risers, her sharp gaze landing on Grace the moment she entered. "You look like you didn't sleep," Ruth observed, sliding a cup of tea across the table. Grace sighed, sitting down and wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. "I didn't." Ruth didn't press, just sat across from her with a knowing look. "It's about him, isn't it?" Grace exhaled slowly, staring down at the tea. "I don't know what to do. He's different. He's trying," Ruth corrected gently. "That doesn't mean I should forgive him," Grace countered. "No," Ruth agreed, "but it does mean you have a choice. You can let your anger make the decision for you, or you can decide what's best for you, not for revenge, not for proving a point, but for your own peace of mind." Grace swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the cup. She hated how much sense Ruth made sometimes. Later that morning, as she stepped out onto the city streets, the crisp autumn air made her shiver. The job didn't start until Monday, but she didn't want to sit still, lost in her thoughts. Without thinking, her feet carried her toward a familiar part of town, a place she hadn't dared visit in months. The Bennett building loomed ahead, a glass and steel monument to wealth and power. It was the last place she wanted to be. Yet here she was, standing on the sidewalk, staring up at the empire that had once felt like a distant dream, her fingers curled into fists. She had been here before. She had walked through those doors, her heart full of love and foolish hope, only to be thrown out like she was nothing. She should turn around. She should walk away, but instead, she squared her shoulders and stepped inside. The lobby was as immaculate as she remembered. Marble floors, high ceilings, people dressed in designer suits moving efficiently through their day. A few turned to look at her, recognizing her face, but she ignored them. She headed straight for the receptionist, who blinked in surprise at the sight of her. "I need to see Alexander." The woman hesitated. "Do you have an appointment?" Grace lifted her chin. "Tell him it's Grace." A few minutes later, she was being led through the halls she once thought she'd never step into again. The elevator ride felt longer than it should, the soft ding of the doors opening making her heart pound a little harder. When she stepped into his office, Alexander was already standing, as if he had been expecting her, even though they both knew he hadn't. She didn't speak right away, just took a moment to take him in. He looked different here, controlled, powerful, every bit the businessman he was raised to be. And yet, there was something in his eyes that softened when they landed on her. "Grace," she folded her arms. "I got the job." A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "I know." She narrowed her eyes. "You knew?" He gestured to his desk. "Margaret called me this morning. She wanted to thank me for the recommendation." Grace's stomach twisted. "So you were involved?" "No," Alexander said quickly, stepping closer. "I didn't ask her to hire you. I just gave her your resume. The rest was all you." "Grace?" She searched his face, trying to find any sign of manipulation, but there was none. Just quiet sincerity. She let out a breath. "I didn't come here to thank you." His expression didn't change. "I know. She hesitated, her arms tightening around herself. "I needed to see for myself if you were serious." Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. "And," she let out a small, humorless laugh. "I don't know." He stepped closer, just enough that she could see the faint shadows under his eyes. the exhaustion that came from more than just lack of sleep. Then, let me prove it to you. No pressure, no expectations. Her heart clenched. And if I decide I don't want you in my life, his throat worked as he swallowed. Then I'll respect that. Grace hated how much that answer affected her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she exhaled and shook her head. I should go. He didn't try to stop her, but as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. I never stopped loving you, Grace. She froze, her breath catching. She wanted to turn around, wanted to believe him, but she couldn't. Not yet. Without looking back, she walked out, leaving him standing alone in the office that once felt like a second home. The weight in her chest didn't lift as she stepped into the elevator. If anything, it grew heavier. Because for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was walking away to protect herself, or because she was afraid of what she might find if she stayed. The city bustled around Grace as she stepped out of the Bennett building, the crisp autumn wind biting at her skin. She walked briskly, hands stuffed into the pockets of her coat, heart hammering in her chest as if she had just run a marathon. No matter how much distance she put between herself and Alexander, it never seemed to be enough. His voice still echoed in her mind. I never stopped loving you, Grace. She clenched her jaw and forced herself to keep walking. It didn't matter. Words were easy, promises were fleeting. He had once sworn to love her, to stand by her, and yet he had abandoned her when she needed him most. But something about today had shaken her, the way he had looked at her, not with entitlement or expectation, but with regret, and worse, hope. She didn't know what to do with that. By the time she reached the shelter, Ruth was already waiting in the common room, knitting like she always did when she was thinking. She barely looked up when Grace entered, as if she had been expecting her. Well, Ruth finally said, not bothering with pleasantries. Grace sighed and dropped onto the couch beside her, rubbing her temples. I don't know. Ruth set her knitting down and turned to face her fully. You don't know what? Grace let out a frustrated breath. What to do? What to feel? What's right? He's different, Ruth. Ruth arched an eyebrow. People can change. Not him, Grace argued, shaking her head. He's always been... She stopped herself, unsure how to finish the sentence. Alexander had been arrogant, entitled, raised in privilege and power, but he had also been kind, in his own way. He had made her laugh, had once held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, before everything fell apart. Ruth studied her for a long moment before speaking. Let me ask you something, Grace. If you weren't carrying his child, would you still be this torn? Grace stiffened. That doesn't matter. It does, Ruth countered. Because if the answer is no, then maybe the only reason you're hesitating is because of this baby. And that's not enough. Grace swallowed hard, her hands unconsciously resting on her belly. The baby shifted slightly, a soft reminder that soon, she wouldn't have the luxury of overthinking. Soon, she would have to make decisions that weren't just about her anymore. She bit her lip. I don't trust him. Then let him earn it, Ruth said simply. Not because he wants to, but because he needs to. Grace closed her eyes. She hated that Ruth was making sense. The next morning, she started her new job. It felt strange to walk into an office again, to be surrounded by desks and the quiet hum of productivity. The marketing firm was smaller than she had expected, a far cry from the Bennett empire she had once been adjacent to, but it was hers. She spent the day learning the systems, getting a feel for the work, and by the time she left, exhaustion weighed heavy on her shoulders. But there was a small spark of pride, too. She had done this, as she stepped out of the building. Pulling her coat tighter around herself, she nearly dropped her phone when it buzzed in her pocket. She fumbled with it, expecting a message from Lillian or Ruth, but it wasn't. Alexander, how was your first day? She stared at the screen, debating whether to respond. She could ignore it, pretend she hadn't seen it. But something in her resisted that instinct. With a sigh, she typed back, Grace? It was fine. A moment later, another buzz. Alexander, just fine. She rolled her eyes. Grace, good, happy. She waited, expecting a push, a demand, something that would remind her of the man who had once dictated every aspect of his life with confidence. Instead, the reply was simple. Alexander, I'm proud of you. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She didn't know why that hit her the way it did. She shouldn't care. His approval shouldn't mean anything. And yet, a small, stubborn part of her felt warm at his words. She locked her phone and shoved it back into her pocket. She wouldn't let this get to her. The next few days followed the same pattern. She worked. She ignored the ache in her chest. And every evening, Alexander sent her small, quiet messages. Never intrusive, never demanding, just simple things. How are you feeling? Do you need anything? I hope you had a good day. Ooh. She never encouraged him, but she never stopped responding either, and that terrified her. One evening, she left the office later than usual. The air had turned colder, the city streets illuminated by the golden glow of streetlights. She was halfway to the shelter when she felt a familiar presence nearby. She turned, and there he was, standing near the entrance of a bookstore, hands in his coat pockets, looking at her as if he had been waiting. Her heart stuttered in her chest. "You're following me now?" she asked, crossing her arms. Alexander held up his hands. "No, I swear, I was just..." He gestured toward the bookstore. "I was buying something." Her eyes narrowed. "Buying what?" He hesitated, then pulled a small paper bag from his coat. Slowly, he extended it toward her. She took it cautiously, unfolding the top and pulling out a book. Her breath caught. It was a parenting guide. Not just any guide. One she had casually mentioned months ago when she was still his. When they had talked about the distant future as if it were certain, she had told him, half joking, that if they ever had kids, she'd be the one reading every book and he'd just roll his eyes at her. She swallowed hard, the weight of the memory pressing down on her. "Why would you..." "I just wanted to understand," he said quietly. "What you're going through, what to expect. I didn't want to be ignorant anymore." Something cracked inside her, just a little. She looked at the book, then back at him. "And what happens if I tell you it doesn't change anything?" Alexander's jaw tensed, but his voice remained steady. "Then I'll keep trying." Grace stared at him for a long time, the book still clutched in her hands. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was walking away from him, or toward something she wasn't ready to admit. Grace barely made it back to the shelter before the weight in her chest became unbearable. She walked straight to her room, closing the door behind her as she pressed the book Alexander had given her against her stomach. Her heart pounded in her ears, his words still lingering in the quiet of her mind. "I just wanted to understand what you're going through, what to expect." She sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the cover of the parenting guide. It wasn't an extravagant gesture. It wasn't flowers, expensive gifts, or grand apologies. It was something simpler, intentional, and it terrified her. Alexander had always been a man of big gestures. He was raised in a world where wealth solved problems, where apologies came wrapped in diamonds, where money could wipe away mistakes like they had never existed. But this was different. He wasn't trying to fix what had happened. He was trying to understand. She placed a hand on her stomach, feeling the subtle movement beneath her fingers. The baby had been kicking more frequently now, growing stronger with each passing day. Soon, she would no longer be alone in this. Soon, there would be a tiny person in her arms who needed her to be strong, to make the right choices. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Grace." Ruth's voice was soft but firm, laced with that knowing tone that made it clear she had been watching. Waiting for Grace to talk, she hesitated before standing, opening the door just enough to see Ruth's face, lined with quiet understanding. "You okay?" Ruth asked, tilting her head slightly. Grace swallowed, then sighed, stepping back to let Ruth in. The older woman didn't say anything, just sat on the bed and waited. Grace had come to learn that Ruth never pushed. She just let people come to their own conclusions. After a long pause, Grace finally spoke. "He bought me a book." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "A book?" Grace let out a dry laugh, shaking her head as she sat beside her. "A parenting book, the same one I mentioned to him months ago." Before everything fell apart, Ruth's expression remained unreadable. "And how did that make you feel?" "That's the problem," Grace admitted, rubbing her hands over her thighs. "I don't know. He's not the same, Ruth, or maybe he is, and I'm just seeing things differently." "People don't change overnight," Ruth said carefully. "But sometimes, Life has a way of forcing people to change. The question is, do you believe him? Grace swallowed hard. I want to. Ruth nodded, as if she had expected that answer. Then maybe it's time to stop running and start watching. Let him show you who he really is. Grace exhaled, rubbing her hands over her face. And what if he lets me down again? Ruth reached over, taking her hand in hers. Then you'll survive it, because you already have. That night, Grace didn't sleep much. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the book Alexander had given her sitting on the nightstand at some point, without really thinking about it. She reached over, opened to the first page, and started to read. The next morning, she went through her routine as if nothing had changed. But something had. The weight in her chest didn't feel as suffocating. The anger didn't burn as fiercely. She wasn't sure what that meant yet. Work kept her busy, which was both a blessing and a curse. She focused on the tasks in front of her, learning the systems, trying to prove to herself that she could do this on her own. But even as she buried herself in her new job, Alexander lingered in the background of her mind by the time she left work that evening. She half expected to find him waiting for her again, but he wasn't there. Instead, there was a message on her phone. Alexander, I hope your day went well. If you need anything, I'm here. No pressure, no demands, just there. She hesitated for a long moment before typing a response. Grace? It was fine. Tiring, but fine. She almost left it at that. But then, before she could stop herself, she added, Grace, thanks for the book. She locked the phone before she could second-guess it, walking the rest of the way back to the shelter with her thoughts tangled in knots. Alexander sat in his car outside his building. Staring at his phone, her message was simple, short, but it wasn't nothing. For the first time in months, he let out a slow breath, his shoulders dropping slightly. She hadn't shut him out completely. That was enough. For now, 2 days later, Grace was leaving the office late when it happened. She had been walking toward the bus stop when she felt someone watching her. A familiar presence. She turned, and there he was. Alexander stood near the entrance of a bookstore, hands in his coat pockets, his gaze fixed on her with a quiet intensity. Her breath caught in her throat. You're following me now? She asked, crossing her arms. Alexander held up his hands. No, I swear. I was just... He gestured toward the bookstore. I was buying something. Her eyes narrowed. Buying what? He hesitated, then pulled a small paper bag from his coat. Slowly, he extended it toward her. She took it cautiously, unfolding the top and pulling out a book. Her breath caught. It was a parenting guide. Not just any guide. One she had casually mentioned months ago when she was still his. When they had talked about the distant future as if it were certain, she had told him, half joking, that if they ever had kids, she'd be the one reading every book and he'd just roll his eyes at her. She swallowed hard, the weight of the memory pressing down on her. Why would you... I just wanted to understand, he said quietly, what you're going through, what to expect. I didn't want to be ignorant anymore. Something cracked inside her, just a little. She looked at the book, then back at him. And what happens if I tell you it doesn't change anything? Alexander's jaw tensed, but his voice remained steady. Then I'll keep trying. Grace stared at him for a long time, the book still clutched in her hands. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she was walking away from him or toward something she wasn't ready to admit. Grace hadn't planned on thinking about him. She had promised herself that after their last encounter, she would push Alexander out of her mind and focus on what truly mattered. Her new job, preparing for the baby, building a future that didn't depend on anyone else. But no matter how much she tried to keep her mind occupied, he lingered. The book sat untouched on her nightstand, a quiet reminder of the conversation they had outside the bookstore. She had read the first few pages, but every word felt heavier than it should have, tangled in emotions she wasn't ready to face. It had been 3 days since she had last seen him. And in those 3 days, he hadn't sent a single message, not even a simple, I hope you're okay. She should have been relieved. Instead, she felt something else entirely, restless. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she realized what was bothering her. For the first time since he had reappeared in her life, Alexander was giving her space. He wasn't forcing his way in. He wasn't demanding answers or pushing her for forgiveness. He was waiting, and she didn't know what to do with that. The next morning, as she made her way to work, she caught herself checking her phone, half expecting a message that wasn't there. It annoyed her. This stupid, pointless hope that she had no right to feel. She was fine without him. She had survived. She didn't need Alexander Bennett to swoop in and play the hero. But then why did the silence feel heavier than his presence? The day dragged on slowly, and by the time she left the office, exhaustion had settled deep in her bones. It had been a long day filled with small mistakes, last-minute corrections, and the kind of frustration that made her want to crawl into bed and sleep for a week. She was about to turn the corner toward the bus stop when she saw him. Alexander was standing across the street, dressed in his usual expensive coat, hands in his pockets, watching her. But unlike the last time, he didn't approach. He didn't call her name. He just stood there waiting. Something tightened in her chest. He wasn't here to pressure her. He wasn't demanding that she acknowledge him. He was just making himself visible, a reminder that he was still there. For a moment, she considered walking away, pretending she hadn't seen him. But then, before she could think twice, she found herself crossing the street. Alexander straightened slightly as she approached, his expression unreadable. "You're not texting me anymore," she said, keeping her voice neutral. His lips twitched slightly. "You told me you needed time." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. No argument, no frustration, just simple acknowledgement. She glanced down at her hands, unsure why she had even confronted him about it. She had wanted space, hadn't she? "And yet you're here," she pointed out. His gaze didn't waver. "I just wanted to see you. Make sure you're okay," she exhaled, shaking her head. "Alexander, I'm not asking for anything," he interrupted, his voice calm but firm. He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I'm trying to figure out how to be part of your life without pushing too hard." She let out a breath, her frustration deflating slightly. "I don't know how to let you in again." "I know," he admitted, his voice quieter. "And I don't expect you to. Not yet." She studied him, searching for signs of the man who had once broken her heart. But he wasn't standing here like the arrogant Alexander she had once known. He looked human, and that terrified her more than anything. The wind blew between them, the city moving around them as if nothing significant was happening. But to her, something was shifting. Finally, she sighed. "I need to get home." He nodded. "Can I walk you to the bus stop?" She hesitated, then gave a small nod. They walked side by side, saying nothing at first. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. There was still so much unspoken between them, so much history weighing them down. As they neared the stop, Alexander finally spoke again. "Have you been reading the book?" She glanced at him, surprised by the question. "A little." "And?" she exhaled. "It's overwhelming. Everything about this pregnancy has been overwhelming." Alexander nodded slowly. "I can imagine." She let out a small, humorless laugh. "No, you can't." He didn't argue. Instead, he looked at her, really looked at her, before saying, "Then help me understand." She stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "Why are you doing this?" His brows furrowed slightly. "Doing what?" "This." She gestured between them. "Trying so hard to be part of something I spent months thinking you didn't want." Alexander swallowed, his throat working as he searched for the right words. "Because I was wrong," he finally said. "And because I don't want to be that man anymore. The man who left. The man who let you think you weren't enough. You deserve better than that." Her breath caught slightly. She wasn't expecting that. She wasn't expecting him to be so raw, so honest. She didn't know what to say. The bus pulled up to the curb and she took a step back. "I have to go," he nodded, stepping aside. "Okay." As she boarded, she hesitated near the door. Against her better judgment, she turned back. "I haven't forgiven you," she said. "I don't know if I ever will." He gave a small nod, something almost sad in his expression. "I know." The doors closed before she could say anything else, and as the bus pulled away, she watched him through the window. He didn't leave. He just stood there, watching her go. And for the first time, Grace realized something she hadn't been ready to admit. She wasn't pushing him away because she hated him. She was pushing him away because if she let herself believe him, She wasn't sure she could survive losing him again. The city lights flickered outside the bus window, casting a golden glow over Grace's face. As she stared out at the moving streets, her reflection stared back at her, unreadable, lost in thought. The conversation with Alexander played over in her mind on an endless loop, every word sticking to her like an old scar that refused to fade. Then help me understand. She had spent months believing that he didn't care, that she had been nothing more than a passing mistake to him, discarded the moment she became inconvenient. But now, standing at the edge of something she didn't know how to define, she wasn't sure of anything anymore, and that terrified her. When she arrived at the shelter, the place was quiet. The usual hum of whispered conversations and rustling blankets settling into the late hours of the night. She made her way to her room. Closing the door softly behind her before sinking onto the edge of the bed, she ran her fingers over the fabric of her coat absent-mindedly, still feeling the warmth of Alexander's presence beside her, the weight of his words pressing against her chest. Ruth's voice echoed in her head. Let him earn it, not because he wants to, but because he needs to. Grace exhaled slowly, reaching for the book he had given her. The pages felt crisp beneath her fingers, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. She flipped through it absently, her eyes scanning words that blurred together before she closed it with a soft thud. She wasn't ready, but she wasn't running anymore. The next morning, she fell into her routine with practiced precision. She woke up, dressed, made her way to work, and pushed everything else to the back of her mind. She convinced herself that if she just kept moving, just kept going, she wouldn't have to deal with the chaos swirling inside her. But even as she sat at her desk, typing away at emails, she caught herself glancing at her phone, half expecting a message that didn't come. The absence of it left an ache she didn't want to acknowledge. By the time lunch rolled around, she was exhausted, not from work, but from the constant war raging in her head. She stepped outside to clear her mind, letting the cold air bite at her skin, grounding her in something real. And that's when she saw him. Alexander stood across the street, leaning against his car, hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression that was unreadable but patient. She should have been annoyed. Instead, something inside her eased. Without thinking, she crossed the street. He straightened as she approached, his eyes searching hers for something. Permission, understanding, maybe even hope. You're making a habit of this, she murmured, stopping a few feet away from him. His lips quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. I figured I'd let you set the pace. You come to me when you're ready, not the other way around. That surprised her. The Alexander she had known never waited for anything. He took, he decided, he controlled. But this version of him, he was waiting. And that scared her more than anything. She crossed her arms, shifting on her feet. I don't know what you expect from me, Alexander. His gaze softened, and for a moment, she saw the man she had fallen for all those months ago, the one who had made her believe in something more before he had shattered it. I don't expect anything, he said simply. I just want to be here. The sincerity in his voice made her stomach twist. She had spent so long expecting him to disappoint her, to manipulate her, to be the man who had walked away that night. But he wasn't giving her that. He was just there. She exhaled sharply, looking away. I don't know if I can do this. I know. He stepped closer, cautiously, as if afraid one wrong move would make her disappear. And I know I don't deserve your trust, but I want to try, even if it takes time. Grace swallowed hard, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. She had spent months surviving, learning how to be alone, telling herself she didn't need anyone. But the truth was, she was tired of fighting, tired of carrying the weight of everything by herself. She looked up at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she let herself see the truth. He was just as scared as she was. She let out a slow breath. I don't forgive you, Alexander. His jaw tightened, but he nodded. I know, but She hesitated, forcing herself to say the words, I don't hate you anymore. His eyes flickered with something she couldn't quite name. Relief. Hope. He took another step forward. Then maybe that's enough. For now. She exhaled, something in her chest loosening. Maybe it was. Maybe it had to be for now.